This thing's on. It's good. Hi, everybody. My name's Paul Carr. I work with ESPN Stats and Information in Bristol, and I'm going to say a lot of the same things that the guys on the panel said, but I think that's a good thing because I want to just give a sense of what we do and how we use data both now, how it's kind of evolved in the last year, and how we think things might change in the future. We work primarily on television, but we touch a lot of different platforms. And so I'm just going to run through, here's what we do, and hope that you can learn things. I'm going to touch on a bunch of different sports aside from soccer or football, and hope to trigger some thoughts and just get those gears turning as far as what we can do with data and how we can present it. So first, give you the real quick background on me. I was born and raised in Topeka, Kansas, which is right here, more or less in the middle of the country, about an hour from Kansas City, if that means anything to anybody. I went to Wheaton College outside Chicago. I came back to Topeka and worked in media for 5 years in radio, television, newspapers, covering all sorts of sports, soccer, basketball, baseball, football, etc. And then I've been at ESPN for almost 10 years now, working in production research. I specialize currently in soccer and Olympics, so I've headed up our World Cup coverage, been on site in Brazil and South Africa, Women's World Cup in Germany. I've worked on 3 Euros. Right now, our main rights are MLS and U.S. national team games, so I'm involved in our game notes and our productions of those. But I also work on SportsCenter. I'm doing that usually a couple, 3 days a week, so I have to be up to speed on all the sports, including soccer. Obviously, soccer gets a lot less play in the U.S. than it does here, but we're still responsible for making sure SportsCenter shows the right highlights and the right games and tells the right stories, just at a much, much simpler level from a time perspective than I do here. So I'm working on all sports. Soccer is kind of my specialty and what I'm leading our department in. What is ESPN Stats and Information? I'm glad you asked. First of all, we're based in Bristol, Connecticut. There's about 150 total people across 4 different departments, and most of ESPN is based in Bristol. About 4,000 people work in Bristol. That's not just production, that's every different level of the company that work there, but there's also about 8,000 people worldwide. We don't serve just the US, we're serving a whole bunch of different countries, but the ESPN Stats and Information, particularly in Bristol, is primarily focused on English language in the United States. So we support all ESPN platforms. We get people asking us questions from marketing and sales and communications and social and whatever it might be. You know, they'll come to us for input on what might be the best game to pick this weekend for a broadcast, or we need some stats to support this PR release we're going to put out about whatever it might be. We're the point people for any sort of statistical, historical, and most importantly, accurate information that any one of the companies looking for. So, you know, when we had our first real blowout World Cup in 2010, the way we did that, I had people from facilities calling me. They're like, hey, are these the right flags I need to put on? Or I need an image of the best player from Ivory Coast, or what, you know, people didn't know anything about anything. We're looking for just questions like that. So sometimes it's really simple, sometimes it gets a lot more complicated. Stats and Info has 4 basic departments. Production research is the one that I'm officially in. We work the most closely with television. So if you see a show on ESPN, there's probably a researcher right off camera that's there to help the producer, to answer questions, to pitch story ideas, to build graphics, to give them stats, information, whatever it is. My favorite random thing that I've been asked was at the World Cup in Brazil. Bob Lee, who's been hosting at ESPN longer than I've been alive, literally longer than I've been alive, asks me, says, Paul, is it a full moon in Rio? You have 10 seconds. So, you know, I'm getting a Google search, full moon, Southern Hemisphere, give him a thumbs up, and 3 seconds later, he's saying it on air. So that's an extreme random example. You know, usually it's a lot more traditional, you know, who the next games, how many goals does this guy have, whatever it might be. But we're there to help with anything that pops up for our talent and for our producers. Stats and analysis, these are the people responsible for data as far as feeds. So they're monitoring feeds that are coming in and make sure everything's both accurate and coming in cleanly. And these feeds are powering things like our Gamecasts on .com, our automated scoreboard panels that we'll use on television. So they do feed monitoring, data integrity. They also do video tracking. That'll talk about a little bit more. When we want certain things that we can't get elsewhere, sometimes we'll video track it ourselves, and that's what stats and analysis does. Analytics these are the people that create analytics. They build the metrics themselves. They figure out the math, they know the programming. They're able to put all that together and come up with something like we'll talk about our total quarterback rating That's an original metric that we can then use to tell a lot of different stories. They came up with that themselves. So they're doing the guts, kind of the hard work and the programming and the code writing in that sort of sense to build different things that we can use. And then bottom line is literally the bottom line. It's the news scroll that runs, and those people are a little more in the curation and the news editing mold, where they're picking the best stats, the best information to put down there. And they have to have the editorial judgment to know what the best things are, and they have to know the proper context and way to present those things. So these 4 departments kind of all add up to ESPN Stats and Information. There's overlap, but this is more or less what we do. And we always say, it was touched on in the panel, we're in the storytelling business. We're here to tell you the story of a game, what happened, the story of a player, who is he, how did he do this, the story of a season, whatever the stories are that come out of a game or a season or a player, we're there to tell those stories and try to use statistical and historical information. And so that's one of the ways that we do it, historical information. Sometimes the story is historical. The U.S. didn't win, they lost both their first 2 Hex games in the final round of World Cup qualifying. Never done that before. That's your lead story. It got Jurgen Klinsmann fired. So sometimes that's the best thing. Sometimes the traditional stats are the best story. Your typical counting stats, whether it's goals or points or home runs. Aaron Judge broke the Yankees' rookie home run record already. That's the story. He broke Joe DiMaggio's record. The Yankees have been around forever. They're the most storied franchise in baseball. He's already broken the record. It's a traditional stat. It's still the first story of that season so far. And then sometimes we use advanced stats and metrics, and this is when we're getting into expected goals with soccer, our total quarterback rating that I'll talk more about. Sometimes we want to go deeper. It's when you get in that second and third day that people are talking about of stories. You're going to talk about whatever, the Golden State Warriors every day for a whole NBA season. You got to get deeper to find new ways to tell these stories. And people always ask, where do we get our information? It's like most things, it's kind of a mix, and there's 3 main buckets that we're drawing from. One is public information. If you're familiar with baseballreference.com, they have great historical tools and information. So something like that, we vetted, we know it's reliable. We use it just like anybody could. We have subscription services to third-party types like Opta, where we're paying them money, we're getting their data, we're taking their data and turning it into putting it on a website that we use internally that's more user-friendly. And we do that with Opta, with the Live Sports Bureau, with several places like that work with media companies to provide information. And then we have proprietary databases. Before the 2010 World Cup, I decided we need a database of every World Cup goal. So we went through, 700 FIFA match reports, pulled out over 2,000 goals, and we're slicing and dicing them any way we can. So who scored, who they score for, who they score against, what was the minute, what was the score when they put that in, how old were they, things like that. And then that sets us up nicely to, at the 2010 World Cup, when Thomas Muller scored his 2nd goal of the game, we were able to find very quickly that he was the youngest player to score 2 goals in a World Cup match since Pelé, which is obviously a great note. So we build these proprietary databases just because we need them and they don't exist anywhere. So we do that with a lot of things. So that's kind of where we get the information that we generate all of our stuff with. So just kind of running through how we use these different types of data that we have. As I said, sometimes the best story is a straightforward number, a traditional stat. The story of the Super Bowl this year was that the Patriots were down 28-3 and they came back to win. That's your headline story. It was an unbelievable comeback, but your number one story is that they were down by 25. It was the biggest comeback in Super Bowl history. What we then try to do, this is a good graphic, this is a fine graphic. What we tried to do, especially in the last couple years, is find new ways to present the information from a visual standpoint. SportsCenter launched a brand new studio almost about 3 years ago. And so instead of a graphic like this that we would take full screen, we could take a graphic like this, which tells the same story in a little different way, and we can throw it in a studio monitor and move the camera around it. With the number so big, the font's bigger, we can do different things with it. It gives us options to be creative, to be eye-catching. Maybe we're hoping that you don't change the channel as quickly, that you're flipping channels and you see something that's a little more attention-grabbing and you're sticking around. So we'll show some examples of that in a little bit, but this is a good way that we take a traditional, straightforward number and make it prettier, to put it quite simply. So here's another way. So this is from a playoff game earlier this year. This is our normal graphic, fairly straightforward. Kawhi Leonard, his column on the left had a lot more points than James Harden, shot a lot better from the field, and the percentage was obviously much better as well. So this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this, but we can also pretty it up a little bit by showing their shot charts. So here you have the numbers. You can also just, if you just glance at it, you can see a lot more red X's. So it's more visually arresting, and you also have the added benefit of seeing, oh, look, James Harden missed a lot of buckets in the paint. Then maybe you set up an analyst to say, well, why was that? Well, the Spurs did this, blah, 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 blah. So this is another option. And then the option that we introduced this year was taking this one step further, and it went like this.
Scoring. There are some really interesting numbers that we had from last night's game. Let's take a look at this, because it's really not hard to see when you look at this why the Spurs were able to turn this one into a rout. Looking at playoff games in which they took at least 10 shots. Wednesday night, the best shooting game of Kawhi Leonard's playoff career, the worst shooting game of James Harden's playoff career. And Harden just 3 for 17 from the field, while Kawhi 3 for 4 from three-point range alone, 13 for 16 overall. Here's how Popovich summed it up.
So you can see those are the same shot charts from what they contain. We were just able to put them physically in a monitor, move the camera around, have the anchor talk over them a little bit differently, and it makes a prettier picture. So this is the same sort of thing that we've done. This is a game where Curry and Thompson didn't have particularly good games. The points weren't terrible, but they shot poorly. We can make it a little more obvious just by doing this. Missed a lot of shots. And then we can make it even a little more fun and better visually on SportsCenter by doing it like this.
Hands down, Durant had his best night in the playoffs, and the Warriors, they certainly needed it because Steph and Clay were anything but splashy. Combined, they were 7 for 29, or about 24% from the field. Now, that's their lowest field goal percentage in a postseason game. Period. Done. Even more telling, check this out. They were this bad from beyond the arc. Those two combined to shoot 20% from three. Numbers like that we have seen just once before. Of course, it didn't matter because the Warriors, they still won.
So this gives some obvious advantages. You put the talent on camera, which they always like. It's a touchscreen, it's interactive, so she's able to, highlight exactly what she's talking about instead of just using the words. The graphic itself is telling the story a little bit better. So these are an example of these touchscreen shot charts that we developed in the last year or so, really this NBA season. They just give us another way to take your traditional stats, just your counting stats. How many shots did you take? How many did you make? How many did you miss? How many points did you have? And dress them up in pretty ways. So we're always looking to do that because these kinds of numbers are never going to go out of style from a storytelling standpoint. Now, sometimes those numbers don't tell the best story of a game or a season or a free agent signing in this case. So then, free agent signings next. This is just a simple example of going deeper with traditional stats. Clint Dempsey scored his 48th goal. This is a couple years ago against Panama in the Gold Cup. He was second before he scored, and he's second now. But all you got to do is just go one cut deeper, and you can see, hey, that goal is pretty notable. So suddenly we've got something that can drive a highlight. It can be a talking point on a show. Then there brings up the question, is he the greatest U.S. goal scorer ever? I don't know, but you might be able to generate compelling content off of that, pulling your analyst in. So again, this isn't advanced. This is just your normal stats, and we're taking it at one step further to try to give people something to talk about, to give them a hook. This is something that we could sell to SportsCenter, and it's going to make a highlight. And it's a reason for SportsCenter to spend that 30 seconds, maybe an extra 30 seconds on a U.S. soccer game they may not have put a show or as high in the show or something before. We can do the same sort of thing with this free agent signing using advanced statistics. So Andre Iguodala signed for millions of dollars with Golden State again. Why would they want to re-sign him if he was 4th and 5th in these major categories of points, rebounds, and assists for the team last season? If you know how the team works and what he does to the team, you know that he's really good defensively. So then we're looking for a number or a way to quantify that. So these two columns are his plus minus, basically how much Golden State outscored their opponents in the NBA Finals the last 2 times they won the title. And you can see Iguodala is at the top, presumably because he was really good at shutting down the Cavaliers when Golden State was facing off against him. And this, we're not saying necessarily that Iguodala is the best player, but this is something that's telling you a story that he is valuable to the team. And this ideally would set up an analyst to explain that. Maybe you would roll a video clip of him defending LeBron James really well, or whatever it might be. So this is not a super advanced metric, but it's something beyond your very basic box score stat that can show value. So this is where this tells a story, and really more the story of the signing. Why does Golden State want to re-sign him than just looking at his raw numbers? Sometimes the advanced stats don't exist, and this is where our analytics team has decided in 2010 that they were finally going to take the plunge and figure out a better quarterback rating. We needed a new metric because the only one that existed was the passer rating, which was devised by the NFL in the 60s or 70s, and just had so many issues from a functionality standpoint, from the data it included, that we knew we could do better. It's the most important position in American sports, so this is why we knew it was worth it. There's all kinds of metrics we'd love to do. We just have to know we're going to get the return on investment, get the development time to do it, et cetera, et cetera. We knew anything we do for a quarterback is going to be gold because we talk about quarterbacks all the time on our NFL shows, on SportsCenter, et cetera, et cetera. And it helps us just from a storytelling standpoint. If you want to show a trend or how they're doing, and you got to list off touchdowns and passes and yards 3 times for 3 games or whatever it is, then you're looking at 9 numbers and your eyes glaze over a little bit. If we can boil it down to a single number and simplify the storytelling, that gives us an opportunity to have a bigger impact on a show, on our viewers, et cetera. So, how did we go about doing this? First of all, we started by talking to players and coaches. We're fortunate that we have a lot of them on staff. So this was Ron Jaworski in the middle and John Gruden on your right, who were doing Monday Night Football at the time. So they, among others, had an impact on this. We're asking them, what would you add? What needs to be in a total quarterback rating that is more than just a passer rating, that is better than that? And so they're bringing things up to us. Most of it's things that, we had planned and whatnot, but just getting their input, getting their judgment is very important. So old passer rating didn't count rushing yards. So Cam Newton, among others, wasn't getting credit for his 50 rushing yards a game that he would pull out. So we wanted to get that in. The old quarterback rating counted an incompletion as an incompletion, regardless. Our quarterback rating was able to factor in drops. If you hit the receiver in the hands and he drops it, quarterback isn't going to be punished as much. There's some judgment involved, but this is why we train up people to make these judgment calls. This is why you scrub every game and make sure people are doing it right. This is what we do. And game state, meaning under the old passer rating, first quarter touchdown when it's 0-0 was just as valuable as a game-winning touchdown on the last play of the game. And so we wanted to account for that. And we put all this in. Most of it was pretty simple. I say that like I have any idea how it really gets done. But most of it was there in play-by-play data, which the NFL has now. And so it's easy enough to take those feeds, translate them into something that we're going to use, and add it to the quarterback rating. Expected points added is a little more complicated, but it still makes a lot of sense because points are what win football games at the most literal level. And so if you have first and 10 at your own 20, you're expected to score 1 or 2 points per drive. If you have first and goal from the 1-yard line on the other end of the field, you're expected to score about almost 7 points a drive. And so as you progress down the field, your expected points gets higher. That gets factored in to the quarterback rating. It's one of the kind of building blocks that we use for that. And then in some ways, the most important thing was that we just scaled it from 1 to 100, which seems really obvious, but the old NFL passer rating was scaled from 0 to 158.3. Why? I don't know. So just the fact that we did this made it simpler and in some ways better because it's easy to grasp. 50 is about average, 75 is pretty good, 90s is great. Easy to understand because it's a scale that people use all the time. So how do we use it now? Well, the first step we did was as we developed it, we got talent and producers on board. I talked about how we use talent to help develop the metric, and then we went to more of them. We would hold seminars, one-on-ones, whatever it is, to get them involved. The panel talked about selling things to audiences and talent, and it's the same thing here. If we can't get talent and producers to understand it, they're not going to be able to get viewers to understand it. So as a researcher and in Stats and Info, we have to be able to tell the talent concisely what this means and how to say it, and then they have to do it in a way that they can then say just as easily to a viewer. So we have to simplify things and make sure they understand what they're talking about. And we have to show them how it's better than passer rating. And that's where it comes, we're like, look at all those things it involves that are not in the traditional passer rating. It's better because we're doing this and this and this, And they'll generally, it's fairly intuitive, just saying that. You don't have to get into the math of it. We're just saying, hey, we're factoring in rushing yards. We're factoring in how much time he had in the pocket. We're factoring in how much time's left in the game, what the score is, things like that. And they're like, oh, well, I would do that, so that makes sense. And then we just have to use it intelligently. It's not always, they're talking about how like a shot map may not always be the best thing to tell the story of a game. QBR is not always going to be the best thing. So you just have to find good situations to use it. So one of our analysts was saying something about how Eagles rookie Carson Wentz got better as the season progressed after he kind of struggled in the middle. So this is taking QBR, splitting it into 3, 4, 5 game chunks and showing that, look, he started well, dipped, and kind of got back. Now, 65 is not a great QBR, but it's above average. He's a rookie. So he went through his lumps, and in theory, he responded. And the analyst is like, oh, I get it. Because this exactly matches his point. And this goes to the find the data to support what your analyst is saying theory. We just have to use these numbers in a smart way to tell stories that are going to get told one way or the other. And if you do that, you continue to do that and back up their points, they'll buy in. And then they'll come to you asking questions when they maybe don't have ideas yet. So it's a process. But there's a relationship between researchers, talent, and producers that you build, and you build that trust, and then they keep coming back for more. So now what? Now we're always just looking to expand the metric. We're trying to get it out there more, find new ways to get people to learn about it. And one of the ways in this last year we did it was on our Stats and Info blog. So every week we're writing about the top 3 quarterbacks and the bottom 3 quarterbacks in QBR, and just explaining a little bit. So this is Matthew Stafford. His numbers 23 for 36, 2 touchdowns and an interception. Don't sound that great. So why does he have a QBR of 89, which was one of the best that week? On a blog, we have much more time to go into it and explain it. So he threw a touchdown pass on the last play of the first half, so that's very valuable just because of the time left. And then he threw a game-winning touchdown pass in overtime, which is obviously a good thing. So those were 2 big reasons that his QBR was as high as it was. So 89 QBR, his passer rating would have been, I think, about 85, which is, average or subpar for him from a passer rating standpoint. But you weight things, and you can see that he had a better game than you might have thought just looking at the numbers. And then we're continuing to reevaluate and see what we can add. We've added an opponent component to this. So this game was also against the Vikings, which were one of the best defenses in the NFL last year. So we got a little bump. If he'd done the same thing against the Jaguars or a less impressive team, then it would have been a little bit lower than it was because it was against the Vikings. So we're always looking to see how we can make it better. If there's more data available, if someone has a different idea, if we're learning something just isn't as accurate or whatever it might be, then we're willing to make these changes. So the QBR, I think, is a good example of how we tried to connect with an audience. And that's always important, especially as we look forward, because if the audience isn't buying in, then there's not a lot of value in developing your own metric or in using certain stats or whatever it might be. So you have to make it understandable, you have to make it appealing. This is why we scaled it from 0 to 100, because it was easy to understand. Even if we had just taken the old passer rating and found a way to scale it from 0 to 100 instead of 0 to 158.3, that would have been an improvement. But we could obviously do a lot more than that. Make it appealing. That's why we picked the quarterback position, because it's talked about. It's, again, the most important position in North American sports. That's the impetus behind coming up with the whole metric in the first place. Context matters. The panel said this. Anyone in Stats and Info will always rail on this. Context matters. You have to explain and give as much context as you can, as much as possible. This is why we're adding rush yards to QBR. We're adding drops to QBR. We're adding game state to QBR. All this context makes the metric so much better. The old passer rating just looks at your total numbers for the game. Doesn't look at any play-by-play and how important any play may or may not have been. We can add the context of every single play and what it does, and it makes the metric that much better. Use the platform smartly. We talked about television, 15 seconds on a graphic. That might be all you have. But you have a studio, we can use the studio, we can throw things in monitors, we can make it pretty. Then if it's a blog, we have more time to explain. Use that wisely, use it to explain. So we try to, like I said, evangelize QBR that way by showing people more than you can do in a 15-second segment on TV. Some of these graphics also work great on social. So we learned that we had these graphics for television. They also work really well on Twitter or Instagram or Sports Center feeds, whatever it might be. So we found new ways to use things we already have on different platforms and use them in a smart way. We've also learned that predictive metrics are valuable, and the panel touched on this as well. People want them for their own selfish reasons. Your fantasy sports, gambling happens even in the US, even though some people may not want to admit it. You got your money at stake. Sometimes you just want to look smart to friends. So this is why part of the reason that we developed, we have a football power index, a soccer power index, a basketball power index. These are all predictive metrics designed to tell you the chances of a team winning, losing, drawing the game if that's relevant. They're designed to get you talking. It's the same way I suspect that here in the UK you often use betting odds to say, hey, here's what might happen in this game. What do you think, pundits? It's the same sort of thing. It just gives us another way. We would like to think the rationale behind it and whatnot is a little bit smarter, but it gives us another way to kind of set the stage and then have our analysts, well, I think that's a little high and I think this is why. We're not going to we don't want to argue about the very specific. I think it'd be 60% favor, not 65. Well, okay, whatever. But we really just want to set it up and say, if you don't think it should be that high, tell me why. And it's like, well, this defense is better and they've been playing well and so is hot or whatever it might be. So we use the predictive metrics because they're appealing to fans. They're pretty easy to understand. We put them in percentage forms. The US audience tends to be a little less savvy. 12 to 5 favorite, I'm not sure, something like that. But you put it in a percentage, it's pretty easy. So we use those predictive metrics and we use them in all these different ways as well. More future. We talked a lot about tracking data, and it's coming in all sorts of sports. Anything you can monitor visually, electronically, this is what Opta does with their touch-by-touch data that they have their analysts do during games. This is what we want to add. They want to add. Everyone kind of wants to figure out how to put on-field positioning into, say, expected goals models. You always say, well, that was an easier shot than expected goals rates because he didn't have to be in front of him. Well, what if we could add a pressure system to it? Then that would make expected goals better. And when you can integrate that on-field positioning with your expected goals model, that's something that I'm sure Opta is looking to do, and you can make it better that way. More measurables. This is a baseball thing especially. There's all sorts of things you can measure in the field, can make it better. Biometrics, I think, is a little more of a team level thing. Danny touched on it, used it in training a little bit. A lot of teams will, heart rate monitors, some even wear them in games, stuff like that. So I think it's more useful at a team level probably than a media level at the moment. But as that data gets out, if it gets out, it might be something as well that could be handy. So this I just want to kind of set up where these major North American leagues are in terms of tracking data right now, just to give you kind of a picture of this game. They have StatCast, which they put cameras, a bunch of cameras in every stadium, and they're tracking almost anything you can track with these cameras. So things like exit velocity, which is how fast the ball comes off the bat. How far did a fielder run to make a play, which they can then calculate the likelihood that someone would make a play. So, you got a really fast center fielder, Lorenzo Cain of my Royals. He gets to a ball that they can say only 5% of the time that's out, and that's a really good play. Just to add some quantity to that. So MLB's got lots of stuff like that. NBA, almost every team, I think every team, is using some sort of visual tracking. Same thing, cameras in the arenas. It can tell you simple things like how often, does this guy go left when he drives versus right, and then you adjust your defense that way. It can tell you where are these holes in the defense. This is maybe where you're going to try to exploit them offensively. So it's a pretty standard thing in the NBA. We use things like that on our analysis for NBA broadcasts as well. So the NBA is not all that far behind baseball overall. NFL, I would say, is a little further behind, at least from a public standpoint. They're still sorting out things like who owns some of these rights. The players' union's a little wary of, can the NFL or can the teams, if they see, my guy slowing down, they're going to pay him less money, and obviously they don't want that to happen. So they're still sorting out some of this stuff. It's not as public. I think it's there behind the scenes, and the teams are definitely trying to use them. They're sorting out, who owns this data, what can we do with it. So it's out there, not quite as prevalent at this moment from a public standpoint. So say that to set up how baseball is using these tracking data, and some of it is really intuitive and works out really well and opens up some good stories. So exit velocity again, how fast does the ball come off the bat? And this is a real simple graph. You hit the ball 100 miles an hour off the bat, you got about a 50% chance of getting a base hit. If you hit at 106, it's up to 70%, and then it kind of levels off from there. So what we've seen over the last couple of years, you see stories here and there about guys who just tried to hit the ball harder, and their strikeout rate is up, but when they make contact, they're hitting it harder. They got a better chance of getting a hit. They got a better chance of getting a extra base hit. So this is pretty intuitive, and it kind of matches the story of what several players have been doing over the last couple of years. Now, sometimes the numbers don't always add up, at least yet. So launch angle sounds kind of complicated, but it's the angle at which the ball comes off the bat. And you can look at the numbers, and if you hit up to a certain point, you got a better chance of getting a hit, and then once it goes past, whatever the number is, then it's probably a fly ball and a pop-up, you're gonna be out. So there have been a lot of articles in the last couple of years, hey, this guy's trying to swing with more of an uppercut, hit the ball in the air, because fly balls have a better chance of getting a hit than a grounder. So one of our guys for 538.com decided to see if that was true. And this is kind of messy, but the short answer is no. So if you're Daniel Murphy, okay, so your x-axis is that your fly ball rate has gone up, and your y-axis is basically your offensive production, using one metric to measure that. So Daniel Murphy's hitting more fly balls, and his offensive production has gone up. That's great. It didn't work so well for Jason Hayward, though. So, and just collectively, you can see there's no real pattern here. So the next step is, okay, well, why does it work for some guys and others, not others? And that's where you got to, is it the mechanics? Maybe. Is there some other tangible or intangible thing that you can figure out the pattern to who it is? And we're not sure yet, but we only have a couple years of data to really sort through. Maybe in 5 more years it's clear. We're not really sure. But this is a good example of we have the data, we're just not sure what it means yet. But we'll figure it out, we hope. And that kind of leads me into this, whatever this next step for tracking data is, it kind of starts with volume, because volume is context. It talked about how, Sigurdsson well under or overachieved his expected goals. Is that a pattern or is that a skill? From one season of data, you're not sure. You go back 2 or 3 or 4 seasons, if he's exceeding it every season, then you probably think there's a pattern. More volume gives you more context. So give us this big pile of numbers, let us sift through it and figure out what's going on. We mentioned combining the trackables with other information. The expected goals model is a perfect example of this. Again, if we can add more elements of keeper positioning, of number of defenders between the shot and the goal, of pressure on the ball, whatever that is, you can get a better picture for what would be expected from a given shot. And we're always trying to fill in that what's missing gap. What is missing? This is what we're doing with QBR. Like we're missing the rushing yards. We're missing the sacks that a guy takes that are bad. We're missing the element of game state. We're always trying to fill that in. People point out holes in expected goals, in quarterback rating, passer rating, whatever. We're trying to fill that in. And the more information we get, and trackables have a lot of this information, the better we'll be able to make all of our metrics. So that's going to be, I think, a field to watch. And it already is. It's already something that's in play. And as we try to merge it with what we have, that'll be a big important thing. But we're just trying to answer key questions as we look to develop more metrics or better metrics or whatever it might be. And we always we go back to the beginning kind of. We're just trying to figure out what stories we want to tell. With the QBR, we want to tell the stories of quarterbacks. And we were able to do that. Then you have to figure out, what do you need to tell them well? We knew we needed all this data, this specific data, to tell a quarterback's story well. And then you have to figure out how you get the data. So in our case, like I said, a lot of it was in the play-by-play feed, and it was fairly easy to parse that into what we needed. Some of it didn't exist, so we had to start video tracking to do it ourselves. So now we have people video tracking every single NFL game and telling you, how many guys did they rush? How much time do you have in the pocket? Did the guy drop the ball or not? Was it the throw inside the numbers or outside the numbers? All sorts of things that help us tell these stories better. Think about it. So the keys overall, just be open-minded and imaginative. We knew we wanted a better quarterback rating, and it just took us a while to figure out how to get there. We had the idea, it took time and data and availability and whatever. You don't have to develop a metric, I don't think, to, you don't have to get super advanced. Maybe it's more of a branding thing, and or maybe it's being consistent and using the same sorts of stats or numbers every time to tell these same stories. So metric is an option, but it's not, by no means is it an essential thing. As we've said, these historical stats and traditional stats will sometimes tell the best stories, and when they do, you want to use them. So you just have to, it's a possibility, but it's not an end-all. Just having a metric doesn't mean it's a good thing. We talked about bad data. Bad data can be as destructive as good data can be constructive for a team or an organization or media. And the most important thing, we've said this time and again, we have to present information in a clear and contextual way. So we've got to give you a number and make sure you understand it, whether it's adding a rank. If I tell you, a guy had 9.6 expected goals last season, you're like, I think that's good. If I can tell you it's, best on his team, that gives you better context. 17th in the league gives even more context about kind of where he ranks. So we're always trying to add context with ranks or whatever it might be, and just be clear about it. This is where the presentation comes in. This is why we developed those big number graphics with the big 25, because we're trying to point out 25 is the story here, and here's why. So you always want to present it clearly. You always want to present it in context. So I hope that's made sense. I hope it's been informative, maybe enlightening, but really I just kind of want to get those wheels turning. Here's how we do things, and we know here's how other companies do things, and just get those wheels going as to try and figure out how to best tell these stories, how to best use all this data in sports media.